The church doors closed behind her like the final click of a life she had been rehearsing since she was a girl. Music swelled. The world narrowed to petals and satin and the man waiting at the altar. Ariel's breath was steady until a hand, rough, unexpected, touched her arm. A voice, low and urgent, slid into the space between the vows and the song. "You're in danger. Pretend I'm your dad." The words hit like cold water. For a second, everything went wrong in the right way. The flowers blurred, the organ softened to a distant hum, and her pulse filled her ears. The touch was gentle but insistent. She turned. A broad-shouldered man stood in the aisle, wearing a cut over a plain shirt, a vest bearing the emblem of the Hells Angels on the back. He wasn't part of the wedding party. He didn't look like trouble, but he wasn't there to admire the bride either. Ariel had imagined this moment 1,000 ways. Smiling faces, the embrace of family, the relief of something sacred finally being hers. She had not imagined a whisper that carried the force of a verdict. She swallowed. The officiant continued, oblivious, words flowing like a river that suddenly had a boulder in it. Flash, a text she deleted because she loved him. Flash, Daniel's laugh when she suggested dinner with her mother and he said, "That's not a good idea tonight." Flash, the way he leaned into her conversations, steering them away from friends he didn't like. Each memory sharpened. Each memory demanded attention. The whisper was a lens. It focused what she had been softening for months, the coldness behind Daniel's charm, the small erasures of her life. Ariel had lost her father when she was young. His empty chair at the head table had been a quiet ache she promised to fill by giving herself to someone who would never leave. Maybe that was why the touch in the aisle felt like a betrayal and a blessing at once. The stranger's next words were quieter, but they landed like a hand on a shoulder. "Pretend I'm your dad." He said it as if it were a shield more than a lie, as if putting him in that role might buy her the space to hear herself think. If you love true-to-life rescues and second-chance stories, hit like and subscribe. He called himself Michael Callahan when he finally let a few people near enough to ask. He didn't offer a long introduction. He had a voice that had been used to breaking things and then trying to put them back together. Gravelly, cautious. He'd been sitting near the back with a few others, he said, when he'd heard Daniel at the reception hall 2 nights before, boasting to a friend about how easy it would be to tie up loose ends once a woman was married. Michael claimed he'd heard Daniel brag that marriage was a way to protect his investments, control dressed up as stability. Ariel didn't know whether to believe a man with a patch on his back. She didn't know whether to disbelieve the tiny hairs rising on her arms.
What mattered was that the whisper had done its work. It stirred something in her that politeness had buried, a certain animal sense that had never left her after childhood losses. People kept their eyes on the aisle, the bridesmaids' bouquets trembling with the withheld breath of a room about to explode into applause. Ariel let her hand rest on the groom's sleeve and felt the fabric of his suit like a boundary she might cross unless she stepped back. Daniel was charismatic in public, smiles measured and practiced, but behind closed doors, those who cared about Ariel would later describe a different rhythm of behavior. He had a way of narrowing the world. Friends who questioned his decisions found explanations that made them doubt their own memory. When Ariel mentioned wanting to visit her mother, Daniel made jokes that felt like traps. Little things piled up, calls that had to be answered immediately, plans rearranged to suit his moods. Ariel loved him. She also lived inside the kind of small, consistent unease people learn to call normal because they don't have language for anything more dangerous. Michael's presence at the church did not feel cinematic in the movie sense. It felt messy and human. He wasn't swaggering. He wasn't making a scene. His hand had been a small, exact contact. No flourish, no challenge. He told Ariel in the hush of that moment that he'd overheard the boasting. He said what he thought she needed to hear, that she should listen to the part of herself that had been quieted. He said plainly, "You're in danger." She could have made excuses. She could have smiled and carried on. The faces in the pews were expectant. Mothers were weeping joy. Cameras tilted, searching for a perfect frame. Ariel felt the weight of that collective hope and the private knowledge that hope sometimes hides danger. She had been promised forever. She had been warned in a whisper. The turning point came faster than anyone expected. Daniel was proud and possessed of a temper kept mostly in check. When a bridesmaid stepped between Ariel and the man who had touched her arm, just a polite step, a small question, Daniel's smile fell off like a mask. His hand closed on Ariel's wrist, a grip that tightened when she tried to move away from him. It wasn't cinematic. It was simply too close, too controlling. A gasp ran through the church like a cold wind. The reaction was immediate. People murmured. Phones lifted. The officiant's voice faltered. Michael didn't yell. He stepped forward. His stance was solid, not theatrical. He put himself between Ariel and Daniel because that was what the whisper had prepared him for. The biker brothers in the back rose slowly, faces tense but deliberate. They were present, not performing. They formed a visible line of people whose very visibility made the space safer. Michael's hand on Daniel's shoulder was not a blow. He used words first, measured and direct. He told Daniel to release Ariel. He told him to stand down.
No one cheered when Michael intervened. The room was too stunned. The bridesmaids clustered, shielding Ariel more with their presence than with any dramatic act. It was like watching a pressure valve open. There are moments in life when authority arrives in strange forms. For Ariel, that authority was a man wearing a patch. For others, it was an official, a friend, a mother who came running when she heard the commotion. Ariel's mother, who had sat outside waiting for photos, arrived at the front with the single blazing determination of someone who had already lost too much to wait. She reached for Ariel with hands that steadied rather than controlled. The police were called. That was one of the clearest, most practical facts in the chaos. Officers arrived, statements were taken. The word danger moved from a whisper into paperwork. In the following hours, details came out. Rumors about debts, stories of Daniel's quick temper, accounts of conversations people remembered differently once given the space to speak. Nothing in those moments became a final verdict. The truth that appeared was messy and human. Bills, angry boasts, patterns of control, and the sudden need to reconcile what Ariel had hoped with what she was being shown. Ariel made the decision that had been gathering inside her like a silent agreement. She stepped behind Michael not because she needed a protector to claim her, but because in that small act she found room to refuse. It was a refusal that belonged to her. She told the officiant she could not go on. Her voice did not tremble with apology. It held a steadiness she had been practicing in private for months, a steadiness born of listening to the whisper she could no longer ignore. The wedding stopped, not with dramatic shouting, but with a careful collective exhale. Guests left in small knots, talking in low voices. Some left confused, some left angry. Ariel's dress gathered at her feet like the last page of a book she'd decided not to finish. She put on her shoes herself, without help. She hugged her mother first, and then she did something that surprised both of them. She walked over to Michael and with a gloved hand touched his sleeve in a gesture closer to thanks than to fealty. In the weeks that followed, Ariel's life was less of a single dramatic scene and more 1,000 small decisions layered together. She stayed with her mother for a while. She changed passwords, reconnected with friends she had let drift, and began making appointments for legal advice and for therapy. She learned to answer the question, "How are you?" truly instead of reflexively. People offered pity. Ariel accepted empathy, but she kept her resolve. The whisper had done its job not by fixing everything, but by making possible the one thing she needed, the ability to choose. Michael's backstory came in short bursts, not as exculpation, but as context.
He told her simply that he'd once lived a life that cost him everything that mattered most. He lost a daughter, he said, because he had not been the kind of man who stayed. He carried that grief like a ledger, and protecting others felt like a kind of penance. He did not demand gratitude. He did not expect forgiveness. He told her his mistakes plainly, not to claim moral high ground, but to show why he could not stand by when he heard harm being spoken about as a plan. He wore his patch like an honest scar, a marker of a past, not a promise of future virtue. Ariel found something in him that was not heroism so much as a stubborn, human responsibility. He had been reckless once. He had also learned to put himself between danger and people who reminded him of what he had lost. That did not make him flawless. It made him complicated and real. Ariel accepted that complexity. She needed to, because her own life had become complicated in the same ways. Choices to be made, mistakes to reckon with, relationships to rebuild. One afternoon, under a gray sky that felt like a promise rather than an omen, Ariel gave Michael a small bracelet. It was nothing flashy, just a simple band with an engraving they both could look at without feeling embarrassed. On the inside, in a quiet script, it read, "Chosen Family." It was not a romantic gesture. It was not a vow. It was a sign that their crossing of paths had become something mutual, a recognition that family can be made out of strangers who intervene, and out of people who return when called. What happens next did not look like a fairy tale. Ariel did not instantly recover. She had days when the whisper slipped back into her mind and shook her confidence loose. She also had days when she laughed loud enough to remind herself joy was possible. She reconnected with old friends. She learned boundaries with people who had once dismissed her discomfort. She started a small support group online to help others recognize red flags and trust their instincts. Nothing clinical, just a place to swap stories and resources. Michael kept his distance in some ways. He visited more often than not, but he never tried to center himself in her recovery. When people wanted to simplify his role into the story of an unlikely savior, he pushed back gently. "I didn't save her," he told Ariel once, his hands folded. "She saved herself. I just happened to be loud enough to remind her she could." In the end, the whisper that day in the aisle was both literal and symbolic. It was a direct warning, yes, and it was also a crack in the script Ariel had been following. That small directive, "pretend I'm your dad," gave her permission to treat the moment as a space to reconsider, to give herself the benefit of doubt she had denied for too long. It allowed her to choose. There are no clean endings when lives intersect like this. There are only continuations.
Daniel's debts and temper were talked about by people who knew him. Papers and calls were made. The police took statements and provided a procedural certainty that in itself felt like a kind of relief. Ariel did not seek headlines. She sought a life she could stand inside without flinching. She learned to walk without the rehearsal of someone else's approval. She rebuilt parts of herself with the painstaking care of someone laying a mosaic, one piece at a time. Sometimes the pieces fit beautifully, sometimes they were jagged and required reshaping. She accepted help and gave it where she could. She did not return to the person who had signed the marriage certificate that day. Michael never asked for the bracelet to be proof of absolution. For him, it was a quiet thing, a reminder that choices have consequences and that protecting another person can be part of making amends. For Ariel, it was a symbol, a new kind of kinship born from an emergency that could have been disaster, but was instead a turning point. When she walks now, she sometimes thinks of the aisle and the hand that touched her. The image feels less like an accusation and more like a pivot, a tiny, decisive moment that altered the angle of her life. She still misses the father she lost. She still holds grief the way one keeps a warm stone in a pocket on a cold day. But she has also found other people who will meet anger with a measured voice and who will stand without spectacle when they need to. The story isn't about a motorcycle patch or a dramatic rescue. It's about a woman who listened to a whisper into the small, uncomfortable truths that had been living inside her all along. It's about the fact that help comes in forms you might not expect, in that deciding to protect yourself can be the bravest thing you ever do. If this story moved you or made you think of someone who stood in your corner when you needed it most, share it and tell us below, who was your unexpected hero? And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe for more true stories about second chances and the people who give them.